There are people from certain parts of the world, certain cities, who identify themselves by being a resident of that city, right? I think about New Yorkers or people from Chicago or Romans or people from London, Londoners. The identity of those towns, the cultural gravity, the history, the weight of them is so thick that you don't go there and put your stamp on New York City or Paris. You go there because you want to be absorbed into that story. You want its brand to imprint on you and inform other people about you and that you are a part of this great, big, grand story. There are a few places on earth that have that kind of cultural gravity, both because of the achievements there and the legend and the lore, but also just as a function of the sheer amount of time that those kinds of cities have existed. Then there are other places, like you see on the outskirts of Las Vegas, places called Eagle Brook Run at Eagle Stone Dry Creek Bed at Elk Mountain Hill. And that's the name of their thing, and it was built like 9 months ago in August. Well, nobody's going to move there and define themselves by that housing development or that pop-up community. Of course not. It just doesn't merit that. It doesn't have any history. It doesn't mean anything yet. No, you're going to go there and you're going to put your stamp on that kind of a place. Well, maybe one of the cities in all of history that goes on that list or belongs on that list of massive cultural gravity towns is one that you wouldn't immediately think of, but it's one that factors heavily in the book of Esther. And that city is Susa. Susa is situated kind of like Denver, Colorado, or Fort Collins, or Salt Lake City. It's right there up against the foothills in a place where you have the option to go down in elevation depending on the needs of the season, or up in elevation to escape the heat when that makes sense. It's in a beautiful location right at the foot of, what would that be? Is it the Zagros Mountains? We're going to say that's the Zagros Mountains, kind of hooking down along the west side of modern-day Iran, really relatively close to modern-day Baghdad, to historic Babylon. And so it's situated in a beautiful place where if you started the world over 1 billion times, I think 1 billion times, people are going to go build a town right there because it's just beautiful. It just makes sense to have a city there, to have the defensive mountains at your back, and again, all of the climate options that go along with that, the proximity to the Persian Gulf and the river systems that take you into it. It's just a great spot for a city, and it proved to be very defensible as well. It had the right kind of soil, so that very early on in the development of human history, when engineering was still very, very primitive, they could make quality rammed earth walls. The soil was of such a consistency that it lends itself to that. So it was defensible early on. And here's a crazy thing about Susa and its cultural gravity rating that it would have had as we get into the book of Esther. Susa was not just a pop-up capital made by the Persians. It wasn't like Pasargadae or Persepolis, where the history was much more recent. It was unbelievably ancient before the Persians even got there. When Cyrus the Great, and more importantly Darius, who really favored Susa and put a lot of work and effort and energy and artistry and money into building it up, when Cyrus and then Darius walked into the city of Susa, it had most recently served as the capital of the Elamite people, sort of a cousin people group of the Persians and the Medes. Before that, it had served as a prominent city in the now long forgotten Akkadian Empire. But the Akkadians had built over the top of empires who had come before them, who were completely forgotten to the fog of history. By the time the Persians walked into that, they were entering into a city that was already easily 4,000 years old. Just let that number hit. Could you tell by the way I said it that I wanted it to hit, that I wanted it to be like, what the heck? And if you're not feeling that right now, you should just, here, pull up your phone. Turn on your code. There you go. Now on your podcast app, there'll be a little thing that has like a half circly arrow thing, and they'll say like 10 or 30 in the middle. That skips back. Just skip that back a couple times and just listen to me say the thing about 4,000 again, and then catch back up. Okay, now you're caught back up. That's great. Now are you feeling the gravity of that? That is insane. I don't think Rome is 4,000 years old, is it? I mean, if so, it's absolutely primitive that far back. Is Paris that old? Maybe they would make a case that they are, but I don't think Paris or London could make such a claim. Argos, I think, is that old in Greece. Maybe Athens is that old. You kind of have to get to just a few sites around the Holy Land to start getting to that kind of oldness dating back from now. But we're talking about 4,000 years old at the time of Queen Esther. We're talking about 4,000 years old in 480 BC. The original builders of this city existed in, what do you even call it, the Stone Age? Before that? You're talking about the utter primeval era of humanity when you go back and you look at the foundations of Susa. This is a massively influential locale of cultural gravity. And for our story in the book of Esther, I think one of the big reasons that matters so much is it helps us understand the environment here. This wasn't just some run-of-the-mill town. This was Susa, the great Susa. And in the 30 to 40 years leading up to where we're at in Esther chapter 2, Darius the Great and his son Xerxes had been really Persianizing this place. They'd been modernizing a bunch of the infrastructure, and they built this grand palace complex and these new city gates. And a lot of that architecture that we know about from extra biblical history is going to come into play as we work through the rest of the book of Esther. Well, look, one of the questions that you and I have wrestled with as we've worked our way up into the book of Esther and as we've gotten to know just a little bit the main characters here, the main good guys, Mordecai and Esther, one of the big questions is, why didn't all the Jews go home to rebuild Jerusalem when Cyrus the Great said they were allowed to in 538? I mean, here we are, 60 years almost later, and you got guys like this Mordecai fellow, to whom apparently it never even occurred. It wasn't even a thought for him to go home. Well, why would that be? Well, I would submit to you that would be because he ended up in Susa. And Susa isn't like other towns. Susa is one of those places that puts its brand, puts its stamp on you, like New York City or Chicago or Paris or London or Rome. And I think there were probably a lot of the Jews who from the time of the exile on felt like they were men and women without a country, and like they had no identity and they weren't going to feel that identity until they got back to the ancient city of Jerusalem. But I wonder if some of the Jews who ended up in these really established, heavy, dense cultural gravity kind of cities, maybe most notably Susa, I wonder if maybe that having a sense of place itch was scratched by the massive history of Susa. I wonder if for somebody like Mordecai, the fact that Susa was emblematic, just as he looked out over the walls at all of the mounds and the hills that were obviously man-made but now covered over in dirt and stuff, there would have been ruins from previous people groups that would have been visible around and outside of Susa. I wonder if somebody like Mordecai looked at that stuff and found reassurance in it. And was like, you know what? This Persia thing, just like the Babylon thing, just like the Assyria thing and the Acadia thing, just like the Hittites, just like everybody, it rises and falls, it comes and goes. And this great city is pretty stable, and that's pretty cool. But maybe he found some kind of comfort in the fact that Susa was a capital on top of a capital on top of a capital on top of a capital as he thought about the plight of his own people. Now, Mordecai was certainly not callous about the plight of his own people. As we see as the book unfolds, we discover that he cares very, very much about the plight of his own people. And if it wasn't for him doing a little bit of cattle prodding, it's quite possible nothing would have ever been done to save them. So he cares very much, and he factors very heavily as a hero in this story. But also he's either a hero or descended from someone who decided not to go back. There were still open calls to go back. I mean, the Ezra and Nehemiah stuff is still yet to come, and we don't see any indication that Mordecai wants to be a part of that. I think that speaks to how big a deal Susa was and how during the reigns of Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes, this really was the center of planet Earth. It wasn't Babylon. It wasn't Pasargadae. It wasn't Persepolis. It certainly wasn't Ecbatana. It wasn't Jerusalem just trying to get to its feet. It wasn't Athens. It wasn't teeny tiny, microscopic, not that big a deal yet Rome. I think it's the place where the King of Kings, the King of Lands, the King of Earth and Water, the Achaemenid kings sat and held court. that being Susa. If you wanted to have any shot at getting your hands on that most valuable commodity on planet Earth in 480 BC, that being influence with or an audience with the King of Kings, you had to be in Susa. That was the hot spot. And my guess is that Mordecai was distinctively Jewish. He didn't hide his identity, and people could tell that he was a Jew. They call him Mordecai the Jew. But I'm guessing he was also pretty Persian, pretty Susan in terms of some of his assumptions and priorities and stylistic choices as well. We'll talk more about exactly when Mordecai's family got to Susa, got to Persia next time around. There's some controversy about this, questions about the reliability of the text, and I want to give it fair time, so we'll do that tomorrow. But the bottom line is this just seemed like a great day to step aside and talk a little bit more about the setting here and how that would affect the characters that we're looking at. But I suppose what I'm driving at is no matter how big a deal you imagine Susa is, it's probably a bigger deal than that at this point in history that we're looking at. And it's important to look at this and remember that Esther was not some poor backwater girl from far, far out there who'd never seen no big city like this, never before. Nope, she was raised around this. She was cosmopolitan. She was shrewd. She was a city girl who knew how to get around and who knew how to navigate the city streets and the tricky business practices and the difficult social scene that was present in a town as important as Susa. Final thought. I saw some new reviews that came in on the podcast on your various podcast apps. I read all of those. And you're allowed to criticize me there if you want to, but golly, you always are so dang nice, and that's so encouraging. And also, podcast apps love ratings and reviews, and it makes them way more likely to suggest podcasts to new listeners. And I would love to have more people participate in this. So it's a double favor you've done me there. I appreciate the words. I also appreciate the gesture. Thanks to all of you, whether you've ever written one of those reviews or not. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.